So let's go through that example that you just did in the book, number 2 on page 237. On part A, it says to evaluate this expression when x equals -4. And show your substitution. So we'll put -4 in for x. And then we'll evaluate that expression. And I do want you to use your calculator so you're not making assumptions that are not true about the way we have written the math. So since that works exactly the same, I'm convinced that this answer is 4. B asks us to simplify the expression. We simplify expressions like this by using the distributive property. So x times x is x squared. X times 3 is 3x. Then part C says substitute x equals -4 into your simplified expression. So I'm going to put -4 in for x. And again, I'm going to evaluate this on the calculator so that I don't make any mistakes in terms of how the expression is written. And the answer I get is -28. All right, there's still more questions on part C. It said, did you obtain the same value you did in part A? No, that's -4. This is -28. Should you? Well, actually, yes, I should have gotten the same answer. So really what this is telling me is that there's some sort of mistake somewhere in this process. And yet I'm pretty certain that these two expressions are equal, but I'm getting two different answers when I substitute in -4. All right, so let's take a look at why that's happening. There's a rule in math that's very important that says that when you're substituting a negative number, like -4, in an expression with exponents, and we had an x squared in there, you have to use parentheses. All right, that's a fairly long rule. When substituting a negative number in an expression with exponents, you have to use parentheses. So most people just shorten that to, when substituting, use parentheses. That's still a fairly long statement, so it could even be shortened to just when substituting, use parentheses, what's up? So every now and then when a student gets a piece of paper back and it says what's up, what that means is they forgot to use parentheses. So I'm going to go back to our example. So our example had x times x plus 3 when x was equal to -4. And we see from the calculator that the result for that expression was 4. And then we had the simplified version. When x equaled -4. So when substituting a -4, we need to use parentheses around that -4. So let's see what happens if we do that. So now every time I substitute the -4 in, I put parentheses around the -4. Notice that the exponent is on the outside of those parentheses. So let's try that on the calculator. And we get the answer of 4. Now we have that these two match, which is what we would expect because those two expressions are equal. So if we substitute the same number in, we should get the same result out. So this works. Now, do you always need to put parentheses around a negative number when you substitute it in an expression? Well, actually, no. You only need to do it if you have an expression with exponents. Some students find that hard to remember, and so they will always use parentheses when they're substituting a negative number, and then that will always work for them. So let's try some. I would like you to use x equals -7. And substitute that into these three expressions and see if you can figure out where to use those parentheses. All right, take a minute to write that down. It helps if you hit the pause button here. All right, so let's evaluate these. I'm going to use color for when I put the parentheses in the -7. So where the x is, I'm going to put parentheses around -7 and then square it. So I think I know what that should be, but I'm going to go over and evaluate that on the calculator as well. So the result is positive 49. Now that's the same answer I should have gotten as if I were to write x times x, or -7 times -7. And so yes, that should be a positive 49. If you didn't put the parentheses around here, you would not get a positive number. All right, so let's take a look at the next expression. Now this negative sign here is part of that expression. So when I substitute for x, I'm going to put the -7 in parentheses. And you can see where my substitution happened. So let's do that expression on the calculator. Again, there's a negative sign out in front, and then parentheses, and a -7. Close the parentheses, and the square goes on the outside. So the result for this expression is a -49. Now for the last expression, the parentheses were already there, this negative sign was already there, and when I substitute for x, I'm going to put -7 in parentheses. Again, there's the parentheses that was part of the original expression and the squared sign. Evaluating that, so the result of this expression is positive 49. All right, let's try a couple more examples. Actually, let's just try one more. We're going to let x equal negative 13 and y equal 4. And I want you to evaluate the expression and show how you substitute on paper. Also take the time to evaluate that on your calculator. All right, so when substituting, negative 13, we want to put that in parentheses. Now, when substituting a positive 4, you don't have to use parentheses. If you want to, you can. So we'll put y in over here as 4. All right, so let's evaluate that. And the result is 3,380. This is a good example of where you would not want to try and do the work in your head, and so being able to enter it correctly in the calculator is very important. If we had left the negative or the parentheses out and just used a time symbol without parentheses, we would have gotten a negative result instead of a positive result. So here it's critically important to